A journalist, entrepreneur, and author of a new book on a trailblazer in the news world is sharing her story and expertise in Boston. Along with receiving an Emmy Award, our guest is the head of an advertising and marketing agency based in Washington, D.C. Her book, published earlier this year, is called Lucille H. Bluford and the Kansas City Call, Activist Voice for Social Justice. We'd like to welcome Dr. Sheila Brooks. Thank you very much for being with us, Doctor.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Go back to the beginning of this story. You grew up in Kansas City where this paper was published. You were a kid playing near the newspaper office. What was that like for you?
Oh, it was, in those times, it was the 60s. So it was a tough time. It was turbulent times. There was rioting going on in Kansas City, Missouri, of course, in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. I was bused across town in that area to attend school. My aunt lived right there next door to the Kansas City Call, so when I got out of school, I would go to my aunt's house and play in front of the Kansas City Call. And I always said that that was also an inspiration for me to get into the field of journalism, which I eventually did in broadcast journalism.
And for people who don't know Kansas City that well, the Kansas City Call, this is, I guess, the premier paper of the Black community in that city?
Absolutely it is. Kansas City Call is a weekly Black newspaper in Kansas City, Missouri that has been around since 1919 when Chester A. Franklin started the paper. And it still exists today. In those days, in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, the Kansas City Call was published throughout the Midwest in several other cities and states, Kansas City, Kansas, Oklahoma. There was even a Washington, D.C. Paper. So it was very well known then.
We have a paper here at the Boston Globe that won a Pulitzer Prize for coverage of school desegregation when it was really turbulent in the 1970s. What about Lucille Bluford and what she was doing around school desegregation in Kansas City?
Lucille Bluford was a publisher, an editor. She started out as a reporter at the Kansas City Call in 1932 after she received her degree at the University of Kansas. And during that time, because the Kansas City Call is a weekly Black newspaper, we know that the Black press is a press of advocacy. So Lucille Bluford was an activist. She was an advocate. And she was out there being part of protests, sit-ins, working with the NAACP, coming to Washington, D.C. for the 1963 March on Washington. And in her stories that she wrote about segregation, desegregation, racism, sexism, gender equality, all of those issues, protest, solidarity. She was writing about those stories then because in her eyes, she wanted to make sure that her writings helped to influence the civil rights movement as well as the women's rights movement and racism and sexism during those turbulent times.
Well, another reason she was an activist, and I guess had to be an activist, was her pursuit of a journalism degree. Talk about that. That is quite a story.
It is quite a story. In 1939, Lucille Bluford, at the urging of her publisher, then publisher, because she was a reporter, decided that she was going to she wanted to apply to the University of Missouri Graduate School of Journalism because she already had her college degree. And so she did. But by the time she went to register for her first course in the fall, after being admitted to the school, she was turned away because she was Black. And so from 1939 until 1941, over 3 years, she filed 11 lawsuits in the state of Missouri, went all the way to the state Supreme Court. And the court said, you must allow Lucille Bluford to go to school. Well, University of Missouri Columbia did not. They shut down the graduate school.
They shut it down.
They shut it down, citing that the professors, the faculty, and some of the students had to go to World War II. And ultimately, they told her, well, there's another school down the road. It's a historically Black college university, HBCU, Lincoln University. And she did go down there and say, okay, let me see if I could get in. And there was no journalism program because at that time at HBCUs, there were no journalism programs at HBCUs. And as a result of her advocacy, a program was created.
You know, in some ways, I think she must have been a very accomplished journalist, and yet this higher education was really important to her. Why do you think it was?
I think higher education was important to her because she felt during those times, and particularly for women, for black women, she needed to show that she was capable of the work that she did. And I think it's really important. It's one thing to have the degree and to do the work, but she wanted to get that advanced degree so that she could have more visibility. One of the things that she would do in writing stories, she had to mask her identity for so many times. I mean, she wrote under the name of Louis Blue, under a male pseudonym. And she wanted to, I think she really wanted to show the world that she had the intellect, she had the journalistic capabilities, she was a journalist of influence.
What about aspiring journalists? I don't think they face the same barriers, but we don't have the representation in the field that I think we ought to. So what would you tell them?
I think that I would tell young people today, as I always do, is that they need to certainly be an expert at what they're doing. And that means that you don't necessarily need to be just a good reporter. You need to know everything about the world, the issues, the city, the communities that you live in, because you're trying to tell the story of what's going on in your locality. I think so many of us over the years had been moved into positions where we became the expert, the specialty reporter, the education reporter, the city hall reporter. I think now, with the proliferation of news, that you have to have much more worldly views than you have had to have in the past, and that you need to stick to it, and that you need to really be fair, accurate in your reporting, because look at what we have. All we have is journalists being accused of fake news. It's a different era, and we have to make sure that we hold on to those principles and values of journalism that so many of our founders and others have laid out for us.
And of course, if people want to go back to the model for that in Lucille Bluford, you've got the book, so if people want to find that, what's the best way to do it?
Oh, absolutely. We certainly have the book, Lucille Bluford and the Kansas City Call. I know you love this picture here. I certainly do love that photo. You can get this book online at www.lucilleblufordbook.com or at Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, or the publisher, which is Roman and Littlefield.
Right. Thank you very much for being with us, Dr.
Nice.
Sheila Brooks.
Thank you so much for the invitation.